So Sari Rosenberg, as Vicki already said, and as I always say, thank you to Vicki and PBS NewsHour Extra for this space. Yeah, I think it's definitely been over a year that we've been doing these. And it's hard to believe that it'll be 20 years since 9/11 on Sunday, right? Oh, no. Yeah. Which is Saturday, right. I know this Saturday. I've lost track. Can you tell that I was back at school for the first time? I'm like totally exhausted. But yeah, so hard to believe that, and it's difficult because I won't see my students until Monday. And I wish I could talk to them about it on Friday. But that being said, I'm really, I don't think excited is the word to talk about this, but I think this is going to be a really meaningful conversation and discussion to have. And so we have some guests, teachers, educators to talk about their experiences teaching about 9/11, living through 9/11. And the theme of today is teachers as primary sources. You know, this is obviously, it feels like just yesterday to me, but this is an event in the history books that our young people that we teach now don't remember. So this is a great opportunity for us. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our guests today. So I'm going to just do brief introductions, and then I have 4 questions for each of our guests. And then because we have such a small, intimate group, I want to hear from everyone else here. I'm sure you all have your own personal stories around 9/11, whether you were in a classroom with kids or in a classroom yourself, or at a different job, and maybe it made you decide to be a teacher. So I'm really looking forward to hearing those stories. And as Vicki said, this is a sensitive topic. I was in New York City that day, and I'm still in New York City, and I have a hard time talking about it, watching anything about it to this day. It feels just as fresh. So I just want to let everyone know that's where I'm with this, and I'm sure a lot of you all feel the same way. So our guests tonight we have amazing guests, amazing teachers that I admire so much. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. We have Denny Conklin. Denny Conklin, wave your hand, even though you're like with Zoom, we see your name. I like to pretend I'm not on a Zoom sometimes, like we're in a room together. That's Denny. He's a social studies director for Arlington Public Schools in Arlington, Massachusetts, not Virginia. We have Lisa Kapp. She is at St. Anne's School in Brooklyn. And we also have Ricky House. He's at, wave your hand. Let's pretend that we're in a room together and then we can't see your name. And Ricky is at the Murray School. He's a teacher there. That's a school in DC, and he teaches civics. And he was teaching middle school for years before that. He'll tell you more about that. I don't want to steal their stories. So the theme today is teachers as primary sources, sharing our stories, and just collectively discussing how we cover this and working together and maybe finding other ways to teach about it. So my first question, and I'll start with Ricky. So what are your memories of 9/11? And do you share those memories with your students?
Yeah, so I was in 6th grade, and I teach 6th grade now, so kind of interesting there, but I was in 6th grade. I remember it was 4th period. I was in literature class with Miss Ladon, and we were working on something, and she stopped class and she told us, and then our principal got on our school newscast and did a live broadcast, and we took a moment of silence, and they kind of explained everything that was going on. I remember then she turned the news on. I think a lot of the teachers were in shock. I remember teachers crying and just trying to hold it all in, and remember parents coming to pick up their kids, some of my classmates, and for the most part, it was not a normal rest of the day. I remember going to lunch and everyone just being really concerned because I'm originally from Pennsylvania, so we're the state capital. So a lot of the seat of state government in Pennsylvania. So I know both of my parents were working for the state. So that crosses your mind, like, are they okay? Because that could be a target. And then for the rest of the day, teachers really just let us process, ask questions. I think they were trying to process. So it was definitely a very unique day. I do share that story with my students. Tomorrow is our first official kind of full day of classes, and I'll see one of my sixth grade classes and both of my upper classmen classes. And I do plan to tell them a little bit about it, because when I first started teaching, all of my students had been born or just been born during 9/11. But today, it's been several years since I've taught anybody, students who were alive on 9/11.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's always interesting to hear how other people experienced it in different states, not in New York. And it varies depending on if they were close to a capital and where their parents worked. So thanks for sharing that. Lisa, what about you?
So this is an event that has profoundly shaped me as a teacher and really sort of directly impacted how I teach. And on my very first day of teaching secondary school, and the first time ever teaching US history, was September 10th of 2001. And it's a school in Brooklyn Heights, which is just in a 12-story building with windows that are right onto the skyline of Lower Manhattan. I was very excited. I had never taught US history. I was very excited, but nervous. I had been eagerly preparing for that class. I met my students also on September, tomorrow's our first day also. So my first class was on with them on Monday. And then Tuesday, I did not meet that class. I was teaching middle school that day, and the first class was at 10:25. So I was upstairs just preparing, and the middle school office and the copy center looked right onto the skyline. And so I saw the second plane go into the South Tower. So, I had a young child at home, 18 months old. I had a third grader elsewhere in the school. I had just moved to Brooklyn. A few students also had commuted from Manhattan. So my impulse was to gather up those students, get them to my new temporary apartment, an apartment that my kids called the hallway. So it was a narrow garden apartment in Brooklyn Heights with, I had kids in a bedroom trying to keep them away from the TV. I was trying to watch TV, but, I just kept wondering all day long, what am I going to say to my 10th graders? So I was hearing these announcers describe, this is just like Pearl Harbor. I hadn't gotten that far in my preparation yet. So, and also I was in a school where I assumed could have been very directly affected, right? And why would you live in Brooklyn Heights if you didn't work in Lower Manhattan? So I had no idea what I was stepping into. But when I returned to school, I can't remember if they kept us out one day or two. The 16 eager students that I had met on Monday had morphed into this shell-shocked but very resilient group that were really able to engage in conversations about this topic. And together, we spontaneously agreed to start keeping a scrapbook. It was like we had that sense that we knew we were bearing witness to history, that we knew it was an important historical turning point. And for me, this 20th anniversary, as part of this COVID pandemic, I think kids are sensing that same thing, like that they know they're part of history. So we started, putting clippings and pieces of newspaper. A girl, a 10th grader, floating into her garden in Brooklyn Heights was a piece of charred page from a law book. So we just slipped it into this notebook, and it just was very clear that we felt all together that that the past, that history, using James Baldwin's phrase, history is present in all that we do. And it was totally clear. And ever since then, I just sort of have felt like that is really my role as a teacher, right? To establish meaningful connections between the past and the present, to help students connect directly and personally with their study of history, and to, heighten that curiosity and cultivate critical thinking. So this is really often a starting point for my year. It's impossible to avoid.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. You really just you had the firsthand experience with it. Danny, what about you?
So I grew up right outside New York City, in one of the suburbs outside of New York City. I was in 10th grade when 9/11 happened. And it's interesting to think about it because, we didn't have smartphones or anything back then in school. So news was kind of trickling in slowly, and periods were changing. We started to hear rumors passing through that something had happened. And I remember one of my friends saying, oh, like a plane flew into the Twin Towers. And we're like, no, that couldn't happen. Like, you're just like hearing something that's not accurate. And then I got into my next period class, and had this fantastic teacher that she said, something is going on, and she turned on the radio because we didn't have TVs or good internet. And we just listened to what was going on, what the news broadcasters were saying, how they were just experiencing it and talking about it. And she said, this is something you all need to hear about, something that's going on, something that seems really, really impactful, and something that's going to have a long lasting, enduring impact on the United States. And then my next period class was math, my least favorite subject as well. And my teacher in that class did the complete opposite thing. She said, I know you're hearing a lot about things that are going on outside, but we are going to plow ahead with our math lesson. And, we're going to pretend that nothing is going on, and we need to get through our lesson for the day. And I didn't realize this until years later when I became a teacher, but it really had a huge impact on how I approach teaching now and being with my students, because as a teacher, there's been all sorts of terrible things that have unfolded as my time as a teacher: the Pulse nightclub shootings, the Black Lives Matter protests, the January 6th insurrection. And it's always been from that moment when I was in 10th grade where I always tell my students, like, we are going to stop and process this, reflect on it, work through this together, because I never want to be that math teacher that just didn't think about the needs of the students. And it was a really, really weird day. The rest of the day, there were, administrators that were coming to our doors, like pulling out kids one by one. And then people were whispering to each other, like, oh, like her dad works in the Twin Towers. And so there was a lot of speculation. And it's just a lot of it, it's so vivid, but also yet such a blur to me. And just thinking about how all the days after it unfolded, and, I was running cross country then, and I feel like our sports got canceled for like a month after September 11th had happened. So it's a story that I feel like is important to share with my students, again, being kind of a primary source. It's actually not even something I meant to start sharing with my students when I was teaching. I was supposed to do a lesson on September 11th, and I planned this very matter of fact lesson, like a timeline going through events. And I all of a sudden I just started talking about my own experience as a student, and just was a little surprised, actually very surprised, at how emotional I got when I was telling it to my students. And then in the back of my head, I was like, how am I going to do this for 4 more periods of the day? But yeah, it definitely has had a huge impact on myself and on the way I view what it means to be a teacher during these really challenging times.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important, as Liz Ramos wrote, thank you for holding space for the pressing topics with your students. And it is, I think, I don't look down upon that math teacher. I think every human being processes trauma and shocking news differently, but I think it is important as educators for us to really be mindful and think that through, considering the fact that we are unfortunately teaching young people through, as you were saying, and that we're constantly teaching kids through, helping them navigate through trauma and uncertain times. That's just life, right? And I think it is important that we kind of look beyond ourselves sometimes and think about what the kids need. And the curriculum matters, but like one day isn't going to kill you, especially when a traumatic event has happened like 9/11. For me, I'll share briefly. I wrote about it for PBS NewsHour Extra, so you can read the full story, but I'll just do the clip notes. I was supposed to start my first day of my teaching career on 9/11. I was about to start day one as a student teacher at LaGuardia High School. I was at Teachers College, and this was a second career for me. So I woke up and heard this crazy news on the radio about the Twin Towers being hit by a plane. And I thought, that's a sick joke. And then I watched the Today Show as it all went down, and then proceeded to call every friend I could try to reach who worked downtown and told them to run, because they were standing on top of buildings on Canal Street, not realizing that they needed to get out of that area. And I was in such shock that, kind of similar to the math teacher, I went and taught a class. Just kidding. No, I went in and took over I kept saying over and over again to my friends who started congregating in my apartment in Midtown Manhattan. I kept saying, I didn't show up to work. Am I going to get in trouble? And people kept saying, that's an example of shock. They just kept saying, I don't think they want you to come in to school. But that's what we do. And I think it's right. And so I also share my story with my students. And, in the beginning, when I first started teaching at the school that I teach at, that I'm starting my 20th year teaching this year there, when I first started teaching, makes me feel old, but my students were seniors in high school. So we had moments of silence for each time the towers were struck. And I'm sure, and Lisa's nodding along, she remembers that. We had, kids did tributes, kids did spoken word. We were very much a community around it and helping the kids process it. And I'll never forget the day, veteran, not old. Thank you, Ryan. I always look for a chance for someone to tell me I'm not old. Sorry, I got distracted. But I remember that moment when my lesson that went from oral history to just me telling my history, and having to then prompt my students to interview parents or neighbors about their experiences. I also find it really interesting because a lot of my students' families weren't in America on 9/11. So it's always interesting to hear from them what it was like living in Yemen, if they even remember it, or then of course we can talk more later about how it's affected certain populations in this country in adverse ways. So that's my story. I wrote more about it. You can read it later. I want to hear more from our guests. So my second question is, you already kind of answered this about how you incorporate your own story. And I love what you all shared. And I think it must be so powerful for your students. So I guess my next question is, how do you plan to teach it this year? Let's go with Lisa. How do you plan on teaching it this year? Do you plan on doing something similar, or do you plan on changing it based on what the kids are dealing with around the pandemic?
So I think I am gonna go with it. I do think that it's important, and precisely because of what they're dealing with in the pandemic, that they too are navigating real history. So, and like you, Sari, my approach has sort of changed over time. I have a very crystal memory of the 10th anniversary when I gathered up a lot of of magazines on my way to school because of the covers that they had. Every single time, Newsweek, New Yorker had a cover. And so I had students, look at them, what images, what messages, what stories did they tell, how would they design a cover, what was being left out. And then I shifted over to a tactic that was like 3 textbook accounts. So I took from Patriots History of the United States and People's History of the United States and a textbook, Unfinished Nation, and just sort of put each 2-paragraph account side by side for a close, active read, to really look at the question right at the beginning of the year: how could accounts of the same event be different and sort of use it as a way to talk about that history is not the past, it's a story about the past, and that historians make choices where to begin, what to include, what they leave out, so that they're in the doing history, not just learning history. And so I too lately, especially with the event feeling more remote, I've had students do these oral histories with a parent or a friend who lived during the event, and similarly have them then come in and debrief with one another. How are they similar? How are they different? It's sort of as a sort of a first foray into, we'll then do something more extensive later on, like a podcast or something.
That's awesome.
Later in the year.
Right. That's awesome. And Vicky wrote in, the central question for a whole year in any history class could be, how can different accounts of the same event exist, and how can there be so many different perspectives around one event? I love using Patriots history and people's history as well. I often use it in the beginning of the year with the accounts on Columbus as well. It's really effective. Yeah, accounts. I can read your mind, Vicky. It's fine. We go that far back now. So Ricky, what about you? How do you plan on teaching it tomorrow?
I've been going back and forth. I think I'll share my account just to kind of introduce it, but it also will be different for different grades. So I teach 6th grade US history and then 10th grade US history. So I think for the 6th graders, I'll tell my account, we might watch CNN 10 because I know they'll do a big thing about it, and that's appropriate for 6th graders, especially since it's only going to be the second time I've met them. And then I will probably I'm really considering giving them homework and having them interview a relative over the weekend. I've done that several times in the past, probably since my first or second year teaching, with middle schoolers in particular, where they have a list of questions, and then they go home and I give them a night or two and they interview. And it's really been interesting based on where I've been teaching. When I started teaching, I was teaching at a school in Fort Meade in Maryland. So a lot of my students were military families. And this was in 2013. So, I mean, we were still in Iraq, we were still in Afghanistan. I had students whose parents were deployed. So it was interesting gaining that perspective. And then when I moved to the DC area, you had my school in Arlington was 5 minutes from the Pentagon. So you had a perspective there of families who were right in that neighborhood during the time. So it's been very interesting. And the same goes with where I teach now. A lot of these families have been in DC for a long time and know exactly where they were on 9/11 and were in this area. So I am really strongly considering going back to the interview this year for all of my classes, just to have that perspective. And it's a good way to start the year because we talk about what is a primary and what is a secondary source and things like that. And just being able to get those perspectives, I think would be good.
Thank you for walking us through that. That's what I miss about being in a school, just talking to other teachers and brainstorming how we're going to teach something, because it always gives me ideas. And I think I also will probably go back to my oral history, interviewing someone about it, because they don't have a memory. They don't have any recollection of it whatsoever. And I think it is interesting, again, thinking about geography and also the population you're teaching. When you're teaching military kids, it's totally different perspective, and it's personal, and it's a personal in a different way than it is for kids who have parents who are in New York City. And I think that's always important to be sensitive around this topic. And even though it might not have affected you because you weren't around New York or you weren't in an area that you felt threatened, I think it is important to remember that, like, there might be one kid in that room who has a family member who was deployed in Afghanistan and is broken up as of, looking at us leave Afghanistan. And I know that the military community has been going through a rough time, just watching it end and all the issues around that. Denny, what about you? What's your plan for teaching about 9/11? I make it sound so cheery, but it's not cheery at all.
So we're still at the beginning of the year. Today was actually our first day of school back with the students. So, we'll probably start with, do a lot of journaling in our class. So probably start with the journal prompt, very vague about, what is something that makes a moment significant, or what's something that makes a moment pivotal, and have them kind of share some of their examples of that and use that as a lead in to talking about September 11th. I love being here with lots of educators because it makes me feel like people understand me. When I was in 10th grade and 9/11 happened, I already knew I wanted to be a history teacher. So I did, I went out the next day and I bought all these newspapers that I still have with me. So that's usually how I teach, and I think I'll continue to teach it, where I'll give out the newspapers to the students. We'll do a graphic organizer for a See, Think, Wonder. So what do they see? What does it make them think? What does it make them wonder? What does it make them feel? Just give them some time to process it. Then usually we get into a little bit more of like the historical analysis piece, where we ask like some of the larger questions about how does emotion shape memory? Are you seeing anything? But this is the newspapers from September 12th. So are you seeing anything that might indicate that there was a lack of knowledge about the situation at the time period? How are leaders being portrayed in these newspapers? So how is George W. Bush being reported on? How is Rudy Giuliani being reported on? Because the perceptions of them in my time teaching have really fluctuated and changed. I think that's a great instance for students in thinking about how our understanding of historical figures during a time period evolves and can change. So, we'll probably have some opportunities to go over some of those questions. And then, like everybody else, I do an brief oral history thing. We'll do a bigger one later in the year. I try to have students interview two people about September 11th. One, they just have to be from two different generations, I ask. And this gets into what we try to do at the beginning of the year around historical thinking skills and corroboration. So we say, like, if you interviewed these two people, different ages, were their accounts the same? Were their accounts different? Do you think that the age difference had anything to do with the differences or similarities? Did geography play a role in it? Are there other aspects of their identities that you think might have had an impact on how they experienced September 11th then? And then students share those. And I think this year specifically, because Afghanistan's in the news, we'll probably do an extra day where we talk about, kind of flash forward a little bit and talk about some of the legacies of September 11th. And I think it was a PBS NewsHour posted something about the way that 9/11 affected Muslim Americans.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that we'll probably use that as a tool as well to connect back to that journal prompt about what makes something pivotal, what makes something significant to people.
That's awesome. I love this process of just kind of brainstorming and walking through how we're going to teach it. And that's why I want to bring in other teachers into this conversation, teachers or principals. We have a bunch of different people in education in the room tonight. I think that one other way that I like to include 9/11 or incorporate 9/11 is I find that my students struggle with historical context, like putting things in context, understanding the background that led up to the event. And it's that they understand it, they just get tripped up by the term contextualization. It sounds really fancy and scary, but it really is just like, what's the background to this? So I think that's another great, 9/11 is a great topic to bring in historical context and think about how, the idea that teaching about 9/11 today is so different than when we were teaching about it the 10-year anniversary, or even just the context of, like you were saying before, the 1/6 insurrection. I write about that in the piece about how many people, including myself, I felt the same way when I was watching it. And then one of the first things that my students said in class the next day was, "Miss, it feels like we're living through history." I mean, we're always living through history, but that idea of pivotal moments, there are certain moments where you can feel it, that you actually are living through history. You don't have to look back to realize you were living through history. So I think that's really cool to think about it in terms of a pivotal moment. So let's open it up to the group because we have so many brilliant minds here, and I want to hear from all of you. I want to hear what your memories of 9/11 are and how you plan on incorporating it into your classroom. So I'm going to call on Brian because you brought up something really interesting that I have thought about before in terms of if there was social media back then, how different that would be, which is another amazing angle to bring in with your students. So Ryan, would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, we actually were discussing that yesterday, and going through, laying out here's what's going to happen on Friday, just so they're prepared mentally. And I did ask my students today to go interview parents or adults or people for their histories, because I'll share my experiences, but I think there was an article that I read, I think in the Atlantic, about we need to reconnect the emotion for the students that were not alive at that time. So again, in laying the groundwork for it, it just started to become, so little snippets. Here's kind of what we'll do, and here's how that day unfolded. And then I have the newspapers. And so then a student said, well, what if Twitter existed? And okay, let's pull on that thread. And it was really interesting because we talked about how, well, we'd have so much real-time information. It would be really fascinating. We would have been able to tell people, get out of the towers or ground the planes. But at the same time, he said, okay, but think about the Boston Marathon bombing and how people were doxxed who had nothing to do with it, and the amount of misinformation that was spread. And so would social media have been a positive? And so, as that's for a lot of students, the number one place where they're getting their news, we could see the need to vet sources. So it really was an interesting conversation. So I think for some of my classes, they definitely have their appetites whetted for tomorrow. So
that's such an I'm stealing that because that's such a good point, because I actually, for the Boston Marathon, I had just had like a knee surgery. So I was like wide awake for some reason. And I fell down that rabbit hole on Reddit where people were doxing people unrelated to it because everyone became like a true crime mystery solver in real time. And it was dangerous, right? So it's really, counterfactuals orientate that. But in this case, I think it's an interesting discussion, like you were saying, about media literacy, critical thinking, and also makes us question like the 24-hour news cycle. And we did have 24-hour news in 2001, but not to the degree that we have it today, right?
Right.
So it's interesting. Sid, I wanted to bring you in because you just threw out an essential question that I want to steal. Can you talk to us about that? It's a really great idea. You're muted. Sorry.
At certain times, we have to look at what makes a national consciousness. The power of memory over time is something that happens, from the beginning till now. And this gives us a chance to look at what events over our history have made our consciousness. And generally, they turn out to be violent things. They turn out to be wars and events that, are unpleasant. But that thinking that way is something that you can do from, the first Native American lesson that you're giving until yesterday. What creates an American memory? This one is very, very, very strong. And I think over 20 years, it has been a guiding, thought of Americans about a lot of things. And, you can connect it to almost anything that is happening now. I think we became, at 9/11, people who were much more afraid than we were confident.
It's so true. And I think it's also interesting to think about it. And it's hard for young people who are not alive, or even if you weren't very cognizant at the time. It's important for us to remind kids that this was a brief moment in time where partisanship didn't happen around this event, which is hard to imagine now, right? But it galvanized everyone. People were patriotic. I mean, our country has become much more ostensibly divided now, but people were cheering for George Bush and Giuliani, and liberals were. And I think it's important to tell kids about that too. I think it's really fascinating. And then how quickly it became, we say never forget, but we're so divided. Even both sides might be saying never forget, but it's such a divided nation today. It's hard to remember. Lisa brings up a really interesting question about 9/11, back to this idea about national memory. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say really quickly, sorry, I distracted myself. It's very important to bring up this concept that Sid just mentioned about national memory, because in the context of these memory laws being passed in certain states, combating quote unquote teaching critical race theory, aka racism. I think it's really important to talk about national memory, who decides how we narrate that, how we teach that, and also this attack on what some people want kids to learn about and why. I think that's really interesting. Lisa, along those same lines, talking about 9/11 as an event versus an era, which is another amazing topic to introduce events and periodization with kids in a history class. So Lisa, I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
Well, I was just building off of Denny's excellent journal prompt, what makes a pivotal event? And I recalled this headline from the New York Times, but I do think this is like sort of framing, an issue of framing and sort of degree of magnification. I mean, there's been this sort of myopic focus on the day, minute by minute, right? Rather than what is the backstory? What are the events that gave rise? What was the US role in the events that gave rise to Osama bin Laden? And then also what has the impact been? How did this, and so again, that question of your time scale, and also that notion of, there's never just history, there's histories. It's always plural. So I think this is a great example to really bring that forward, is who's telling the story, and for what agenda, and what's been left out. And it's tricky because there is this grief, right, that so many still deeply, deeply feel. So and I feel like the 9/11 Museum has a tension between these two roles of, kind of memorializing the day in a reverential way and analyzing the history.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There is a tension there, because I think it's the tension that exists in our nation around this event era. I think it's both an event and an era in a way, but we can unpack that later. We have Scott Seeley in the house. He just left his open house at school, and he has I'm so appreciative for you joining us, because I'm exhausted just from going back to school for the first day. You had an open house. So thank you for joining us. And you have a really unique experience around 9/11. So what you missed is we were all just sharing our experiences the day of 9/11, and then how we taught it through the years, and how we anticipate teaching it tomorrow or Monday, depending on when we see our students. But I would just love to bring you into the conversation, because I'll just let you talk, because you were actually in the Army in DC on 9/11. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I had just joined like a year earlier. I was in nursing school at Walter Reed on 9/11. So obviously, like, no one was expecting it. So it doesn't even make sense to say we weren't expecting it. But we were, my entire platoon was going through nursing school at Walter Reed, and my unit, my platoon was at the United States Soldiers and Airmen's Home. There was like 10 or 11 of us that were like not quite at Walter Reed, we're just like 3 miles away or whatever. And so I want to just answer that question first of how do I teach students this before I get into it. Basically what I do is I use a presentation where I like align a bunch of video clips and like maps and stuff of what happened that day with how I experienced it that day. So on one side, this is what happened, and I'll show the news with, I think it's Al Roker, but I'm not positive, saying like, it's quiet, too quiet. And I'm like, yeah. And then I'll show right after that, okay, so this is me at 8:58. So we, as the first plane hit, we were just like doing rounds. And when, you know, we were in the break room as a second plane hit, talking in disbelief, and then drove back madly through Washington, D.C. We saw what we thought was a second plane. I mean, you don't just see planes over cities, so I'm assuming that was it. And then we drove back to Walter Reed, and we, you know, went through a furious, we drew weapons and gave blood and did all kinds of other stuff. And as I, you know, I explained to my students, but nobody could make any phone calls that day. All the cell phone lines on the East Coast were jammed. And they asked us for volunteers to go down to the Pentagon at like roughly noon, something like that. So we had about a squad of soldiers go down to the Pentagon for to help the already triaged patients on the lawn there for like 3 or 4 hours or something. So I don't remember the lady's name, but I helped one of the patients that had this like glass blast injury from like, you know, like a little above chest high all throughout her arms. You know, she had just worked for the DOD, but she had glass injuries all throughout her face and scalp and arms. And I was just there with her, reassuring her, you know, trying to get IVs in her and trying to evac her out of there in disbelief while the firefighters are trying to evacuate more patients. So I'm not trying to take too much time, but
No, thank you. No, this is really great because your experience is so unlike anyone else tonight, because you were on the front lines.
That's why I got into teaching. You don't think
so that's what I was going to ask you. So you got into teaching after, first of all, thank you for your service and thank you for what you did that day and what you did in the service. But so when did you decide to go into teaching? Were you in the military a little longer after that?
Yeah, so I did like another 7 years, six years in the military after that. I got out in 2007, but I got into teaching because I was like in Iraq, and I was a nurse in Iraq for prisoners of war, but that had nothing to do with it really. I showed like new nurses or new medics how to do basic medical procedures. And I thought it was super cool. So I'd show them how to do like new IVs or blood draws or, you know, whatever, just basic medical stuff. And I'd see these people get better, like way better at, I thought I was pretty good, but I'd see them get way better at it than I was. So just seeing them develop this confidence with it, and then going to Hawaii, where I was for the next 3 years, and training new recruits to do the same thing, and just seeing them go from very nervous to that. And I was like, well, I just have to teach. I don't even like nursing that much. I have to get into teaching. And it just made too much sense to do social studies.
Wow. And so I think I love your lesson where, and I think it's so important for kids to understand that, you know, you have these events that they watch on the news, and then everyone's individual experience on that day is also a part of history. And it helps them understand the very complex work of historians, somehow finding ways to bring in as many personal stories into the narrative and present it as fact, right? Because your experience was something that is fact. It happened.
Yeah.
Whereas it's just so hard to, and I think it's important to show kids when you're teaching history that it's an action. Like, it's not just memorizing facts. It's very active, hard work to be a historian and weave all these stories and elements together. So I'm sure your kids, your students become so interested in history right away, just hearing your story juxtaposed with what was going on in the news narrative of the day. Kent Williman brings in, hey Kent, how's it going? Kent brings in, yeah, I was watching Memory Box and had to stop watching it. I didn't realize how much PTSD I still have around 9/11 from I was in New York that day. But Memory Box on MSNBC that premiered the other night, I think it was last night, I've lost track of time. They also use personal experiences, reactions. And then Sid was saying it's the individual stories that affect us most. They do. I notice, I'm sure you all notice this as educators, my students could be chatting and half paying attention, let's be honest, they're teenagers. Anytime I start telling my experience within the history, or just like my previous work experience, anything personal related to what I'm talking about, there's a hush. And it's not because they're so interested in me. They can attach to that more, the personal stories. And then you hook them in and then you explain everything else that happened that day and within the events that you're teaching. We have 10 more minutes. I want to get as many educators who are here tonight to share either your memories of 9/11 or how you teach it or plan on teaching it. So I'm going to just take volunteers who'd like to jump in. You could do raise hands or you can just unmute. Everyone's being quiet. Should I call on people? I want to hear from Sarah. Hey, Sarah. Hey, Sarah Jennings. Tell us, you can either tell us your 9/11 memory, and then Erica's next. Tell us either 9/11 memory and or how you incorporate it in your classroom.
So now I'm a director of religious ed at an Episcopal school outside of Boston. Not a school, I mean, we have a school in a church. So we've been doing the whole Zoom church school thing. And but that day I was still full-time in the classroom, and it was my second year, and I was in Brookline in Boston. And so we didn't have smartphones. I have to remind my own 3 teenagers. But my first period was free for whatever reason. I didn't have kids. So I was in the library prepping again, even though I was prepped. And I just saw all these people coming in the library and sobbing like teachers. They were hiding in there from the kids. And so one of the librarians told me what had happened. And so I went to my office and they had a radio on. And then in the course of the morning of those couple hours, people were going like office to office saying, stay, don't play the radio loud. This has happened. We cannot tell the kids. You must teach your classes. Just like, you'll find out later what happened. And I was 7 months pregnant with my first child. And I was immediately just really, first I was shocked and I was like, how long is this going to keep going? And one of my colleagues told me that there was a second tower. And but to have to go through the day working with 6th and 7th graders and just going ahead with your lesson plan while you knew that there was, scurrying around outside and rumors in the hallway. And I remember it just feeling really chaotic. And I immediately was like so selfishly angry that it wasn't being handled better in my school, which is crazy, like looking back on it, because what I've learned after leaving the classroom and working in a church is that what we're really dealing with is grief and how people do or do not approach grief and how you can't control how people behave in a traumatic incident that has death as its centerpiece. So our opening day is Sunday the 12th, and I had to educate my rector because he was 10 that day that yes, we should do something special because it's the 20th anniversary, because he thought maybe we didn't need to. And I said, 2 of my volunteer teachers ran out of New York City. They were like 20 something and they were fleeing the city, and they're still traumatized every year. And one of our choir members lost her colleagues because they were going to a conference on one of those flights out of Boston. So I was like, there needs to be a giant white pillar candle on the altar on Sunday, and there needs to be special prayers. And so I just, I agree with everything that's said. And I think Angie made a comment about kids design memorials. And years ago, I took the Facing History training. And I think monuments and memorials is one of the most important things to make time for when you're teaching history, for all the reasons we already discussed. But one thing I wanted to share is on the 10th anniversary, we had a different rector who's closer to my age. We walked into the sanctuary and she had a giant print of Philippe Petit, who was an aerialist who in 1974 walked on a tightrope between the towers. And so we went into the sanctuary and it was the very first thing right next to the baptism font. And I was like, whoosh, like I couldn't even walk. I was like trying to bring these little kids in and I just started sobbing. And then I was like, why didn't you prepare me? I needed to know that I was going to see that. But a lot of people, it didn't mean anything to them. And of course, the little kids had no idea what that stood for. And I just think art is, building monuments, expressing yourself in writing or in song and making art and showing them art that includes the Twin Towers or going to see the memorial. Those things are super, super, super important and powerful to collective memory building. So
thank you. I'm so glad I cold called on you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's so much to unpack with what you shared. One element is just thank you for making sure that the rector doesn't forget to commemorate 9/11.
mm-hmm.
And that goes along with what Denny wrote, which was, it brings up the important question. He had said this previous to what you shared, that, what are the consequences of forgetting history? And as educators, I see we have multiple roles in society, and one of them is, holding that torch and keeping it going. So when others might be too young to remember or forget or just want to breeze through it because they want to get to the other content, it's important for us, whether we live through it or understand it because we're history teachers, to make sure that we continue to make sure that it's commemorated and we share about it and we don't just breeze over it. So thank you for sharing that. And I think also, and I'm going to call on Erica next, the other really good point that you brought up is around trauma. And we were talking about this today in our professional development, getting ready for kids to come on Monday. I'm in New York City. We have no idea the trauma that our young people went through around COVID losses, COVID deaths, illness, like every kid in this country. And we were talking about how important it was for us to understand that and understand that everyone processes trauma differently and just be so much more mindful of it. I mean, people make fun of trigger warnings, but I think they're really important because if, we talk about so many sensitive topics with young people, and I think it's important that we do, but we need to tread lightly and be mindful that everyone handles it differently. And so I think that's a really good point you brought up as well. Erica, would love to hear from you.
Hi. So I was in 4th grade on 9/11. And I remember my vivid memory is that we had a substitute and it was planned. And we were told that if we were really well behaved with our substitute, then she could decide to take us outside later in the day. And we couldn't go outside, obviously, because we weren't allowed to go outside. Like, nobody was allowed to go out. So I just remember being like really upset because we'd done such a good job and we were so well behaved. And I felt like it really wasn't fair that we couldn't go outside. Of course, we didn't know what was happening. It was my mom actually called my school and was like, I don't want you to tell my daughter. I want to be the one to talk to her about this. And then on the way home, I just remember our bus stop was like one stop for a really large area. And usually we just walked home, but that day, all of our parents were there waiting for us. And so those are like my two really big memories of being like a younger person. And then just everyone crying. And I just was like, I didn't understand it, but I was very sad by you know, just being in the vicinity of sad people. So that's my memory.
Thanks for sharing that. And that reminds me of towards the end of when I was teaching this and kids remembered, one story a kid told was like, I don't remember what was happening that day. I just remember that no one told me what was happening. Everyone was crying, but I got to watch Pokemon that day. And I think that was so interesting to me. And I was like, what? You didn't know what was happening? Oh my God. Only to now teach people who don't remember it at all. Right. So at least you have some semblance of a memory. So we have okay, so let's get to Angie, and then I think we have to wrap up, but I want to hear from as many people as possible. But Angie, please share with us your story and how you teach it.
Well, and it's a big difference with me, where I'm not in a normal school. I'm in a juvenile detention center where I teach. I teach teenage boys from ages 12 to 19. We deal with trauma on a daily basis. So we have to go about it a little bit different because of those different traumas that we deal with, especially a lot of human trafficking, things like that. So it's a big thing. Yeah, not just girls, but boys as well. But taking this though, and and teaching it, and like I said, I'm a construction program. I'm the principal of the construction program. So we, our curriculum, we get to change it, but we can get to add those little things in there. I mean, I've taught every grade from 1st through 12th, so I try to add those things within there. But, making the memorials and trying to make it meaningful for them, because most of, all of our kids, they weren't there when it actually happened. So it's what's very important, especially with the trauma, and just to be there for the kids and to really, kind of help them through everything.
Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to probe a little more on that in terms of, because we were just talking about teaching about trauma in general. You're teaching a population that you don't have to guess if they're experiencing trauma. So any advice for us dealing based on what you advise your teachers and how you connect with the young people that for sure going through trauma? What advice do you have for the rest of us in proceeding with lessons about traumatic events like 9/11?
Sure. It's, it's especially the empathetic approaches. A lot of times more open-ended questioning, things like that, to let them expound on things, because a lot of times talking it out is a really big thing that needs to happen. Actually, I just got back from a training on motivational interviewing, and that was something that they really talked about with trauma, is just basically be empathetic, but be approachable, because that's extremely important when they're going through those things, because, there's so many up and down days, and we teach year round. We don't stop at all. We have a 250-day school year. So it's a different thing, but it's really, that empathy and showing that they're there, because that's a lot of it. It's a lot of, you've got to let them just talk.
Thank you so much. So essentially making sure they feel seen and making sure that they're seen as individuals, especially if they've been dealing with traumatic things like being trafficked and being dehumanized. I guess it's really important to show them that they're all important, significant, empowered human beings. So thank you for all you do. And Vicki was just writing that in the chat as well. Wow. And Sarah, Angie, you are also a first responder. I agree. You are. Thank you. You're saving lives. Thank you. And Scott shared Scott, do you want to, and I want to close out with closing thoughts from our guests. So I want to go back to Ricky, but Scott, I'd love to can you share what you wrote in the chat? Because Vicki wrote that sometimes sharing those stories are the most powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the guys that would end up being deployed with a couple of years later to Iraq, this guy, John, he was like in the car full of people that I'm madly driving through DC with. And I was young at the time. I was just like 18 or 19 or whatever it was, but we didn't know at that point, he's from Brooklyn, but his brother would die in one of the towers that day. And we were planning, his 21st birthday was on 9/11. So we were trying to plan, though I was a minor, how to go out and celebrate his 21st birthday that day in Baltimore. And obviously that plan didn't come to fruition. and we suddenly have a larger than life issue to deal with, and we wouldn't find out that his brother was, in that population for a couple days. But yeah, that's something we dealt with. So when I'm going through that, I show the kids a picture of me and him and one of our other really dearly close friends from 2 years later, hugging in the middle of Baghdad.
Wow. I think it's so important to share that. And that's the first time I pivoted in the way I taught 9/11 was the day when I realized that the kids were showing no emotion around it. And that deeply frightened me for all the reasons that you understand, especially being in New York City. And so the next day I found I think it was a CNN video, and it was just stories like the one you shared, Scott. And it was just collection of just young people talking about their parents never coming back and people talking about surviving. And then I turned to the kids and I said, do you get it now? And they said, oh, yes, we get it. And sometimes it's just that simple, sharing these human stories, showing that this event that seems larger than life and almost hard to process, it's still hard to process that it happened. I'll never get over it. We'll never get over it. But I think it's important to make sure that you turn up the personal stories so that kids understand it and understand why it led to, and why was it such an historical event leading to an historical era, if you will.
It also helps that they get emotion out of me. They're not going to get a filter from me that day. There's just no purpose for it.
No, and you shouldn't. And that goes back to what Denny was talking about, which was what inspired Denny to be a teacher. Was one of the things that inspired him was just seeing how one teacher, you missed this, a math teacher just proceeded with the lesson. Math teachers, just kidding. And during this, everyone knew what was happening. And this teacher was teaching, I don't even know math anymore. I know about cosine, sine and cosine. Is that math?
It was limits.
Yes. Oh, okay. There you go. Like you needed that. I'm just kidding. But right. So you're sitting. And so I think that's important. There are times to be the teacher and proceed with the lesson. And there are other times to show emotion because they're looking to us for those. They're not just looking to us to learn math. They're looking to us to understand how to navigate the world, like what Lisa was saying and Denny was saying and Ricky was saying and you're all saying. So just concluding remarks from our guests about just talking your experiences tonight and what you've been hearing and about teaching 9/11. We'll go to Ricky.
I think just being able to take away everyone's perspective, hearing these different stories. I think really it just matters that bringing in your personal story matters when you're doing this, but also making a connection. I go back to like January 6th, and I think being in DC and teaching in DC and having to teach my students on Zoom on January 7th, there was no way that I was going to have a normal lesson that day because some of my students lived in just moments away from Capitol Hill. So we use that time in all of my classes just to process what happened. But I think you really have to give students time to process, but also make that connection, because something like January 6th, where they lived through that and witnessed it live, is going to be different than a 9/11 that they weren't alive for. So you have to kind of make that history come alive for them.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing up the connection to January 6th. Very important, I think, to connect for the kids. Denny.
Yeah, I mean, I just appreciate everybody's stories tonight and their words, and it really shows how personal this is to people. I guess like the two things I'll say are related to things I wrote in the chat. I think the first one is I always think about just when we're talking about any type of historical moment, like who's part of the we and who's part of the they. I thought a lot about this after the Boston Marathon bombings, when, where I live around here, there's all this talk about Boston Strong. And we had discussions about like, well, who does that include? Who does that not include? Who could that like isolate and marginalize? So I think it's always, really important to see things from that type of an angle. And then just the other thing I wrote about, the consequences of forgetting. I think about how we all just talked so passionately about September 11th. And then I think about how it must feel for people who lived through Pearl Harbor, when they start to see that becoming, less salient in people's minds. I think a lot about, Holocaust survivors and how they are having less and less of them, and how memory continues to go on. So I think that just the topic of historical memory and keeping these things alive is really, really important.
Excellent points. Thanks, Jenny. Lisa?
Thanks everyone for your perspectives and your suggestions and this powerful storytelling. I don't think I have a whole lot more to add. I think the point at this 20th anniversary moment and thinking about this as truly the past, like sort of, and that's sort of like the space of time that turns something from historians' perspective. I heard the author of the book, The Only Plane in the Sky, which is an oral history by Garrett Graff, who sort of made the offhand comment that for our students, 9/11, it could be the Peloponnesian War. I mean, it's sort of that remote. And on the other hand, that's also the opportunity, and to help kids to sort of really know that to understand the present, we have to understand how we got here. And that's sort of Heather Richardson's premise for her Letters from an American, to kind of make these connections. So I think this is an opportunity to teach about the past and the connection to the present.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. I'm so thankful for what everyone shared tonight. And it's given me ideas about how to approach 9/11 and bring kids more into understanding the emotion and feeling around the event, and then helping transfer that to events that I don't have emotion and personal feelings around because I wasn't alive for them. And I think it's helpful to do that. And one thing that I write about in the piece that I recently put on the PBS NewsHour Extra published is, for my students, I teach a lot of kids from the Muslim community, and the effect of the impact of 9/11 on their communities was felt right away in New York City. So if their parents did live here at the time, they remember 9/11 for different reasons. And one thing I often bring up now is, especially after the 2016 election, ICE was originally came out of, as you all know, out of 9/11 to deal with a foreign terrorist threat. I stood there in 2017 reading a letter from the New York City Department of Education telling my students, many of whom are undocumented DACA students, that they are protected in my school from ICE. I can't tell you how much ICE came up that year because of what was going on with the former administration. And so that was how I taught them I used that incident to bring in 9/11. So I think it's important to find those personal hooks and know your students. I think that's the final takeaway. Know your students, because even if they didn't experience 9/11 firsthand, there's a pathway to something that did affect them, that did impact them. Whether it's connecting it to the 1/6 insurrection like Ricky was doing, whether it's connecting it to the terrible effect it had on the discrimination against Muslim people in across the country, it's really, really important. So I just love this discussion tonight, even though I got teary-eyed just thinking about it. And I just want to thank everyone so much for sharing and for all you do. And I wish I could sit in all your classes when you teach this tomorrow or Monday.